Thank you, Paul. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel on ties across the Pacific. The Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada is a think tank on contemporary Asia and Canada-Asia relations, and as such, you can see our particular interest in this topic. We have long said at the Asia-Pacific Foundation that the most dynamic and vibrant aspect of the Canada-Asia relationship is, in fact, the human flows between Canada and Asia. But it was a relatively recent phenomenon, a recent time that we observed that the particular driver of this dynamism in the Canada-Asia human flows was not just the inflows of immigrants from Asia, which continue to be very substantial, but also an observation that there were outflows as well. Hence, we launched a project to look at the phenomenon of Canadians abroad 3 years ago. We are approaching the end of this project and will soon launch what we call the capstone report in the next 6 weeks or so. And it's my great pleasure to share with you some of the preliminary findings of this study. You might ask, first of all, why we have come up with this conception of Canadians abroad. And let me just say that, in the discourse that we've been having here in the last 2 days, and listening, for example, to the speeches from both Justin Trudeau and Olivia Chow, there is a very strong presupposition that that Canada is principally an immigrant receiving country, and secondly, that the asset that we have through our immigrants from Asia and elsewhere is an asset that is domestically based. So when the term is used, the term Canadian diaspora is used, as our chairman used it previously, most people would conceive of it as referring to the visible minority of the immigrant populations in this country, rather than in the, I think, more literal use of the term Canadian diaspora, meaning Canadians overseas. So a major focus of our work has been not simply to provide the empirical basis for a better understanding of the Canadian population overseas, but to try to help reconceptualize the idea of Canadian diaspora and the policy implications therein. Let me go quickly through my slides. I know we're short of time, so I'll have to gallop through this presentation, but start with a quick profile of Canadians abroad. You see from the slide that we have measured, we think, as accurately as possible, the numbers of Canadians living overseas, and have found that the 2.8 million abroad, of course, amounts to a small province in this country, a very substantial number indeed, and as a share of the population, around 8 to 9%, this ranks above countries that you would have thought were more substantial diasporas than in countries such as Australia, the United States, India, and China. The US, indeed, is the largest destination for Canadians abroad. We reckon something in the order of 1.2 million Canadians living in the United States. A familiar story for most of us. Maybe less familiar is the fact that we think there could be around 600,000 to 700,000 Canadians in Asia. By far and away, the largest destination is Hong Kong, and we have recently done some very extensive surveying in Hong Kong of over 35,000 households and come up with a very conservative estimate of 300,000 Canadian citizens in Hong Kong. The majority of Canadians abroad, we believe, are Canadian-born, but the exit rates for Canadian-born are much lower than the exit rates for foreign-born Canadians. Hence, the growth rate for foreign-born Canadians is highest, and we expect that the trend will continue in this direction. So the most interesting part, in a sense, of the research on Canadians abroad is focusing on foreign-born Canadians. Hence, the connection with our work focusing on the Asia-Pacific is so crucial because it creates a new dynamic in the relationship between Canada and Asia, where we have recent immigrants from Asia who have gone back either to their native countries or to other countries in Asia, and who create very interesting linkages with Asia and with Canada. We found from the research that most Canadians abroad are predominantly of working age, and that a fairly young cohort of Canadians have the highest tendency to live abroad. There obviously is great variation by country of origin and ethnic group. We have found that naturalized Canadians from mainland China, India, Philippines, and Vietnam are less likely to move abroad. This was somewhat counterintuitive and a surprise to me, but I should stress that this data we looked at between 1996 and 2006, of course, captures only a relatively early period in the large wave of migration from the mainland, not from Hong Kong. And I fully expect that the numbers for the mainland to rise substantially when we look at the next 10-year period. On the other hand, naturalized Canadians from countries, territories like Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, and Singapore have very high exit rates, and you see the numbers there well up in the double digits. Interestingly, when you look at the Canadian-born Canadians abroad, you also see some divergence in the ethnic origins. And this is going to be a very interesting trend in the future, because it appears that the second generation or third generation Canadians of Chinese, South Asian, Eastern European background have a higher tendency to move abroad than other ethnic groups. And through casual empiricism, certainly in this city, in Vancouver, many of you and I certainly can tell stories of young Canadian Chinese and young Indo-Canadians who were born and brought up here, choosing to go to India, to Hong Kong, to Korea, other countries in Asia to pursue their careers. Hong Kong, as I've said, is the single most important destination for Canadian citizens in Asia, the second most important around the world. Our survey, a very extensive survey, has found some, I think, very interesting information, not just on the profile of these Canadians, but also on some aspects of their attachment, their intention to return, and so on and so forth. I don't have time to go through all of this data. I leave it for you to peruse. But let me just say that the 300,000 estimate that we've come up with is a very conservative one. We think the number could be as high as 540,000. That's an astonishing figure when you think about it. Of course, if you were to count the 540,000 Canadians in Hong Kong as a city, this would rank in the top 10 or top 15 cities in Canada. What are some of the motivations for living in Hong Kong? We found that job opportunities and family reasons are the most commonly cited motivations, not surprisingly, but good to get the validation. They, of course, vary by age, with job opportunity counting as more significant for the Canadians in the age bracket between 30 to 50. Education also remains a very important factor, and you will see in one of the latest slides that, in fact, many of the Canadians in Hong Kong have educational ties to Canada.